The wind that howled down 125th Street on the morning of November 14th, 1946, was colder than the grave. It was a gray, merciless Tuesday that seemed to drain the color right out of the brownstones, leaving Harlem washed in a palette of steel and sorrow. But the chill in the air was nothing compared to the frost that had settled over the heart of Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. At 6 a.m., a time when the city is usually rubbing the sleep from its eyes, a phone rang in the study of his apartment at the Dunbar. It wasn't a business call. It wasn't a number runner reporting a hit. It was a weeping mother. Thomas Johnson, Bumpy's nephew, a boy who had never held a gun, a boy who studied engineering books instead of racing forms, a boy who represented the escape velocity from the streets, had been found. He was hanging from an oak tree in a wooded patch near Van Cortlandt Park in the Bronx. His face was unrecognizable. His fingers were broken. And pinned to his chest was a crude, handwritten sign that used a slur so vile it seemed to burn a hole in the paper. By 8 a.m., Bumpy Johnson walked into the 50th precinct. He did not bring an army. He did not bring a lawyer. He walked in alone, wearing a charcoal wool coat that cost more than the desk sergeant made in 3 years. The station hummed with the chaotic energy of police work, phones ringing, typewriters clacking, drunks shouting from the holding cells. But as Bumpy moved through the room, a radius of silence opened up around him. He walked straight to the desk of Detective Miller, a man with a thick neck, a red face, and a reputation for brutality that was whispered about in the pool halls of Lenox Avenue. Miller looked up, a half-eaten donut in his hand, and smirked. It was a smile that said, "I know what happened, and I know you can't do a damn thing about it." Miller tossed a thin manila folder onto the counter. It slid across the wood and stopped inches from Bumpy's hand. "Suicide," Miller said, his voice flat and bored. "Boy was troubled. Hung himself. Terrible tragedy. Case closed." Bumpy didn't open the folder. He didn't blink. He stared at the detective with eyes that were described by those who knew him as black holes, voids where light entered but never escaped. The air in the precinct seemed to drop 10 degrees. "My nephew," Bumpy said, his voice a low, cultured baritone that sounded more like a university professor than a crime lord, "had 2 broken legs and cigarette burns on his chest. It is physically impossible for a man to hang himself after his hands have been smashed with a hammer." Miller leaned forward, the smell of stale coffee on his breath. He lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper, his eyes dancing with malicious delight. "Maybe he was clumsy, Johnson. Or maybe he just learned a lesson about walking in neighborhoods where he didn't belong. Either way, the coroner says suicide. And what the coroner says goes. Now get out of my station before I book you for loitering." Bumpy stood there for a long moment. He adjusted his cufflinks, ensuring the silver was perfectly aligned. He looked around the room, memorizing the faces of the officers who were pretending not to listen, the men who were suppressing giggles. He wasn't looking at lawmen. He was looking at accomplices. "You are mistaken, Detective," Bumpy said softly. "This was not a suicide. This was a declaration of war. And unlike you, I do not leave my paperwork unfinished." He turned and walked out. He didn't slam the door. The click of the latch behind him sounded like the hammer of a gun cocking back. Harlem is a place of secrets, but it is also a place of eyes. The police and the Klan believed that power resided in badges and hoods. They forgot about the invisible army that ran their lives. They forgot about the maids who dusted their bookshelves, the cooks who prepared their meals, the chauffeurs who drove them to their rallies, and the shoe shiners who buffed their boots while listening to their conversations. Bumpy Johnson returned to the gloom of the 24-hour diner on 135th Street and sat in the back booth. He ordered a coffee and waited. He didn't send out hitmen to kick down doors. He activated the network. By sunset, a woman named Sarah, who had worked as a housekeeper for 20 years in a grand home in Riverdale, sat opposite him. She was trembling, clutching her purse.
"Mr. Johnson," she whispered, "I shouldn't be here."
Bumpy slid a napkin across the table.
"Drink your tea, Sarah. You are safer here than you are anywhere else on God's earth."
Sarah took a breath. She told him about the dinner party the night before. She told him about the 5 men who had been drinking whiskey in the library, laughing about teaching a lesson to a smart-mouthed boy. She told him names. She told him addresses. She told him about the blood she had to scrub off the floor of the garage. Bumpy memorized the 5 names. 5 men. 5 pillars of the white community. A banker, a lawyer, a shop owner, a city councilman's aide, and the ringleader, a man named Silas Thorne, a respectable contractor who wore his clan robes on weekends. Bumpy didn't write anything down. He stood up, placed a $100 bill on the table for Sarah, and walked out into the night. The grieving uncle was gone. The chess master had taken his seat. The board was set. The clock started now. 7 days. 1 week to rewrite the definition of justice in New York City. Day 1. The rope. It was Thursday, November 16th. The banker, Arthur Higgins, was the man who had provided the rope. He was found at dawn, not in his bed, but in the center of Marcus Garvey Park. He was alive, but only just. He had been stripped to his undergarments and tied to the very same type of oak tree where Thomas had been found. But Higgins wasn't hanging by his neck. He was hanging by his ankles, swaying gently in the morning breeze. Around his neck was a sign written in elegant calligraphy. "Gravity judges us all." He was unharmed physically, save for the blood rushing to his head, but his mind was shattered. He had spent 6 hours in the darkness, surrounded by silent men who did nothing but watch him swing. When the police cut him down, he was babbling incoherently about the eyes in the dark. The message was clear. We can touch you. Anywhere. Anytime. Day 3. The hands. Saturday, November 18th. The lawyer and the shop owner, the 2 men who had held Thomas down while he was tortured, were leaving a private club in Midtown. They felt safe there, surrounded by the lights of Broadway. They hailed a cab. The driver was a large man with a scar over his eye. He didn't take them to their homes on the Upper East Side. He took them to a meat-packing warehouse in the meat-packing district. They were found the next morning by the early shift workers. They were alive, sitting upright against a brick wall. Their hands, the hands that had held Thomas, were placed neatly on their laps. Every finger had been broken with surgical precision, mirroring the injuries found on the boy. There were no bruises on their faces, no other marks on their bodies. Just the hands. It was a punishment of biblical symmetry, an eye for an eye, a bone for a bone. The police report noted that the men refused to speak. They were too terrified to name their abductor. They knew that if they spoke, next time, it wouldn't be their fingers. Day 5. The silence. Monday, November 20th. The city councilman's aide, the man who had used his political connections to ensure the police looked the other way, vanished. He didn't show up for work at City Hall. His car was found parked perfectly in his driveway. His breakfast was still warm on the table. There was no struggle, no broken glass. He simply ceased to exist. Bumpy wanted the city to wonder. He wanted the fear to be abstract. Death is final, but disappearance is a torture that lasts forever. Rumors flew through the precinct. Some said he was in the Hudson River. Some said he was buried in the foundation of a new skyscraper. The truth was irrelevant. The psychological impact was total. The remaining members of the local Klan chapter, men who usually walked with the swagger of impunity, began to lock their doors. They sent their families away to the country. They realized that their badges and their hoods offered no protection against a phantom. Day 7. The Judge. Wednesday, November 22nd, the final night. The target was Silas Thorne, the ringleader, the man who had tightened the noose. Thorne had turned his home in Queens into a fortress. He had hired private security. He had a shotgun on his lap as he sat in his living room staring at the fireplace. The clock chimed midnight. The wind howled outside. Then, the lights went out. Not just in his house, but on the entire block. Thorne leaped up, fumbling for a flashlight. He heard a sound, not a window breaking, but the front door unlocking. A key. How did they have a key? The answer was simple. The maid. Thorne leveled his shotgun at the doorway, his hands shaking. "I'll shoot! I swear to God, I'll shoot!" he screamed into the darkness. A match flared. The small flame illuminated a face floating in the blackness. It was Bumpy Johnson. He was sitting in Thorne's own armchair, legs crossed, smoking a cigar. He wasn't armed. He didn't need to be. "Put the gun down, Silas," Bumpy said. His voice was calm, conversational, as if they were discussing the weather. "You're shaking so much you'll hit the ceiling." Thorne didn't lower the gun. "You're a dead man, Johnson. You think you can come here, into a white man's house?" Bumpy took a slow drag of the cigar, the cherry glowing red like a demon's eye. "I am not in a white man's house," he replied. "I am in the house of a murderer. And I am not here as a gangster. I am here as the executor of an estate. You took something from me, something irreplaceable, a boy with a future. You thought because he was black his life was cheap. You thought the price was zero." Bumpy stood up. The darkness behind him seemed to shift. Shadows detached themselves from the walls. Thorne realized with horror that Bumpy wasn't alone. There were men in the room, 4, maybe 5 of them, standing in absolute silence, blending into the gloom. They moved like smoke. "The price," Bumpy whispered, stepping into the halo of the matchlight, "is everything you have." Thorne pulled the trigger. The hammer clicked on an empty chamber. The shells had been removed. The maid again. Thorne dropped the useless weapon and fell to his knees, begging, pleading, invoking the name of God. "Do not pray to God," Bumpy said, looking down at him with cold detachment. "He is busy, and he has left Harlem's business to me." Bumpy turned and walked out the front door. He didn't look back. He didn't need to see what happened next. The shadows converged on Silas Thorne. There was no scream, just the sound of the wind, and then silence. Day 8. The Funeral. Thursday, November 23rd, Thanksgiving Day. But in Harlem, it was the day of Thomas Johnson's funeral. The service was held at St. Martin's Episcopal Church. It was a scene that would be etched into the memory of New York forever. Thousands of people lined the streets. They stood in silence, hats in hands. It wasn't a mob. It was a congregation. When the casket was brought out, Bumpy Johnson walked behind it. He wore black, his head held high, his face a mask of stoic grief. Parked 2 blocks away were 5 police cruisers. The officers inside watched through binoculars. They knew what had happened over the last 7 days. They knew about the broken fingers. They knew about the missing men. But they did not move. They did not arrest Bumpy. There was no evidence, only rumors and fear. But more than that, they were paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the retribution. They had pushed Harlem, and Harlem had pushed back with a force they couldn't comprehend. Detective Miller was there, watching from behind a windshield. He looked pale, diminished. He saw Bumpy stop at the hearse. Bumpy looked up, scanning the perimeter until his eyes locked onto the distant police car. He held the gaze for 5 seconds. He didn't smile. He didn't gesture. He just looked. It was a look that said, "We are even." The funeral procession moved on, a river of black flowing through the streets. Thomas Johnson was laid to rest not as a victim, but as a martyr whose death had purchased a new era of respect. In the weeks and months that followed, the Klan activity in northern Manhattan dropped to zero. The unspoken rule had been written in blood. You can play your games, you can hate, you can discriminate, but you do not touch the innocent. You do not hunt in the king's forest. This story of the 7-day purge is more than a tale of revenge. It is the defining myth of Bumpy Johnson's reign. It strips away the glamour of the gangster lifestyle and reveals the brutal, pragmatic core of his power. He wasn't a hero in the traditional sense. He was a monster who protected his own from other monsters. He understood that in a world where the law was weaponized against his people, the only true justice was the kind you administered yourself. When we look back at the history of Harlem, we see the jazz, the poetry, the civil rights marches. But underneath it all, in the shadows of the alleyways and the back rooms of the clubs, stands the figure of Bumpy Johnson, holding the line. He was the necessary evil. He was the dark knight who didn't need a cape, just a tailored suit and a mind that was 7 steps ahead of everyone else. Some say that on quiet nights in Harlem, near the old 23rd Precinct, you can still feel the chill of that November week. You can feel the weight of the red circle that Bumpy drew around his community. It serves as a reminder that while kings may die, legends never truly fade. They just wait in the shadows, watching, ready to remind the world that there are consequences for crossing the line. What do you think about this brand of justice? Is it ever right to take the law into your own hands when the system fails you? Or does violence only breed more violence? This is the question Bumpy Johnson leaves us with, a question as complex and dangerous as the man himself. Share your thoughts, and let's keep digging into the untold history of the American underworld.